Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first of this year's series of In Conversation With. Today, we're joined by Professor Chen Schechter, who is currently full professor in leadership, organizational development, and policy in education at Bar Ilan University in Israel. Aiming to integrate theory with empirical evidence and practice, his research areas include reform implementation, educational change, professional learning communities, organizational learning, collaborative learning for success, educational leadership development, and systems thinking for school leaders. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Educational Administration, the oldest and most respected leading international journal in the field of educational leadership and management. Ken, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here today. And so now it's over to you.
Thank you, Gavin, and thanks for really asking me to join your series. I'm really thrilled to be here. So thanks again. And thanks to you all participants. And the title of my presentation is School Media Leaders Sense-Making of a Generally Outlined Reform. I would start by saying that this is a joint work with my former PhD, Prof Schechter. And it's nice, I'm telling you, Gavin, and all your future PhD students, it's so nice to have someone who finished with you the PhD and is already professor. So that's my goal when I'm doing in academia, to have my next generation of professors. It's given me a lot of pleasure to do it. And it's already been published in the Journal of Leadership and Policy in Schools a couple of years ago. So I'm trying to bring the idea of school media leaders within the framework of sense-making and a generally outlined reform. So Gavin, now you need to work with me. So this is a small poem by R.D. Lang in the book called Knots, and the title is There Is Something I Don't Know. I like it. I'm doing it every time, even at ARA, that we have like 10 minutes, 12 minutes to present our research. I don't mind. I'm saying this, and because it's very important, it's a stepping stone to what I want to present next. So Gavin, let's start together. Please read it if you can.
There is something I don't know that I am supposed to know. I don't know what it is I don't know, and yet I'm supposed to know, and I feel I look stupid if I seem both not to know it and not know what it is I don't know. Therefore, I pretend to know it. This is nerve-wracking, since I don't know what I must pretend to know.
So what will you do, Gavin? Therefore, you have to say it.
Therefore, I pretend to know everything.
So we continue.
I feel you know what I am supposed to know, but you can't tell me what it is because you don't know that I don't know what it is. You may know what I don't know, but not that I don't know it, and I can't tell you.
So what will happen now?
So you will have to tell me everything.
Exactly. I think it's a nice poem, and I like every time to show it and to read it to different people, different audience, because I think this is I don't want to say the proper, but the better culture that we want when we're making reforms and we're starting to have a dialogue between the different parts in the system, the policymakers, schools, superintendents, teachers. So it's very important for me to start with this poem. So if we're talking and looking at the background, we are looking at school media leaders at the middle layer between the principals and the classroom teachers. And I'm all the time looking as a metaphor, not to a pyramid top down, but much more as a network organization. And in a network organization, what we're looking for the next generation of school media leaders have an important role in taking the reforms and putting them into practice in their daily practices. So especially when we have large-scale changes in schools, and I know in many countries we have large-scale changes, even every 2, 3, 4 years, the goal or the role of the middle leaders is very important to take these ideas and put them into the curriculum, to assess them and to put them into practice. And also with the broad idea of decentralization and school-based management, the idea of teacher middle leaders. They can be subject matter coordinators and grade level coordinators, for example. Their role is very important. However, in research and what we see in the publication, we still lack important information about the important roles of middle leaders, especially when a large-scale reforms is coming in. So, in general, the purpose of the study, this specific study, is to understand the challenges of high school middle leaders, in this case, subject coordinators, and I will talk about it later because it's specific subject matter coordinators who are under the umbrella of implementing a generally outlined education reform. And we see in the last 20, even 10, 20 years, that we have signals of generally outlined reforms in which teachers are expected to exercise considerable discretion about how to take these broad ideas, and I will give an example later, but how to take the broad ideas of the generally outlined reforms and put them into practice. So it requires a lot of perception, a lot of sense making, how to take the generally outlined reform that have limited or minimum guidelines and put them into practice in the classrooms. And Gavin, I like this one. I like this caricature because you can take the picture and say, yes, we all see students in front of a teacher who's saying, be more independent, innovative, critical thinkers, but continue to do the same thing. So there is an inner contradiction. But we can continue talking about the classroom level, but we're taking it to the reform level. Think what happened to teachers, to staff members, to principals, who are on the one hand, all the time the ministry is talking to them about be creative, be inductive, try to come up with the new ideas, be innovative, critical thinkers according to the 21st century skills. But on the other hand, continue to be all the time according to accountability, to high stakes accountability. So think what happened to teachers when they're all the time hear about abstract idea of becoming critical, innovative, independent thinkers, but on the other hand, they know all the time that they will be assessed according to the ordinary accountability high stakes standards. So I'm not sure people will go to this direction so much, but we have to take this picture and think how it's coming into play in terms of reforms that are coming up from top down, and teachers who are continually every 2-3 years hear another reforms of being creative, critical thinkers, but they are suspecting whether this is the right issue or not issue, and whether they will be assessed by high stakes accountability. And we continue. So we talked about the idea of middle leaders and how they are in between policy and practice. And I showed the picture. But now we're getting in the last, I would say 10, 15, 20 years, there is an attempt from policymakers to generate generally outlined reforms. And a generally outlined reform is a reform that does not provide a detailed improvement program. Instead, it includes only very, very broad abstract statement that allows educators to exercise discretion about how to actually meet the new policy goals. And you already see, according to the prior slide, that are we going to generally outline reform, or are we be assessed by the accountability measures? So we are all the time, this is a second point here, all the time in between, and it calls bounded accountability. Where are we in the continuum? Are we more according to openness, being critical thinkers, autonomy, or are we under the umbrella more of accountability? And it's all the time a balanced situation between both. And I would give maybe, Gavin, it's something that's more relevant to you, it's near you, but it's in the same years that I will shortly explain and give an example of Israel, there was also a British government initiative, the National Curriculum Innovation, named the School Improvement School-Led System. So it was also a reform that the idea was that it would be inductive to give autonomy to school leaders, to staff members, to come up with their ideas for school change. But again, we could see how in the UK example, when they had a long history of policy, of reform, of a top-down policy, so teachers and principals did not know how to consider this abstract idea of, hey, let's go. Why are you not going? And we're providing you all the openness to come up with your ideas. But in their mind, according to their experience, they experience only top-down policy. So that's why we call it policy freedom autonomy versus policy structural accountability. And so we talked until now about middle leaders. We talked about generally reforms that come up with a broad, amorphic ideas, and teacher need to implement them and put them into practice. So that's why the conceptual lenses of sense making is so important to these ideas, because, and this is based on Carl Weick ideas of sense making, which is a dynamic, active process of constructing, and this is an important word, constructing meaning from present stimuli, mediated based on prior knowledge, social context, which allows individual to navigate and to understand the picture, big picture. So especially within generally outlined education reform that have a lot of uncertainty, lack of structure. So it's so important to understand how, as a researcher, of course, but also the conceptual ideas, the conceptual lenses of the teacher through sense making, how they are making sense of this ambiguous instance, how they're making sense of this uncertain environment in order to create a mental picture of what's going on in order to make action. So broadly, this is a theory of sense making. It's a circular motion, although it's like a spiral, ongoing motion going all the time. It's not one circle, it's all the time a spiral process. And you can take the idea that we just talked about generally outline reform, amorphic ideas, and they are creating uncertainty, ambiguity, and confusion. And teachers are taking this confusion and they're constructing mental models based on their prior, and we're going right to the right side, prior knowledge, experience, and beliefs. Also, they are constructing their picture, the mental models, according to the school context, whether if the school is urban school, periphery schools, suburban schools, social, the social status of the school, for example. And then they're creating a cognitive map based on the prior knowledge and the school context, the environment, and they're constructing and enacting meaning. The important thing is it's not only a picture, it's also a mental picture that creates action. And it's a spiral thoughts action process all the time. So that was important for me. So just taking this idea where we talked about middle leaders, we talked about general reforms that are very ambiguous, uncertain, and we talked about how important it is to understand the mental models of teachers when they are faced with this kind of overall ambiguous events. So now we're going to the context. And very similar to the year that I showed the British reform, we had also here a national reform that was based pretty much, it was 2014, 2015, that was based pretty much on the idea of the 21st century skills. So if you just read this, meaningful learning is a personal process, the student at the center. of knowledge construction, whereby the learners arouses questions. So it's more an active process, locate resources of information, process information, and create. That's an important word. Create new information that is relevant to them. Meaningful learning touches learner innermost self by facilitating a multitude of mental, emotional, social, physical, artistic, and creative experience. All these are coming, for example, from the OECD 2020, 2030. Everything is really one-to-one, like in terms of the student in the center, not only cognitive aspect, but also emotional aspect. And you can see even down here is while assisting them in delving into subjects that are interest to them, they are at the center and meet their needs. Student and teacher meaningful learning occurs through their interaction with their surrounding and takes place in various spaces. I would say this is almost one-to-one from OECD 2020-2030 that the ministry here took as an idea. Just an anecdote, Gavin, I have to tell you, when it was launched, the title is Meaningful Learning. So teachers said, what's going on? We haven't taught until now meaningfully? What do you say to us? It's like we need to start from scratch. So even it's every time I say even to students that look at the title means a lot. And it means how you perceive the teacher, but it was really offending to teachers when they said, we all the time taught meaningfully. What do you mean by meaningful learning? What do you mean by these abstract ideas? So in 2014, this is what was the first part of launching this meaningful learning reform. And this idea of the 2030 OECD 2030 21st century skill was very strict or very focused or had a lot of implication, especially at high schools. Because high school, as we all know, are bringing students to the matriculation exams to open the gate for university, etc. So the most important change because of the abstract words were in high school. Because instead of having 100% of the grades towards university being the matriculation exam, they were divided. 70% were a continuation of the regular external matriculation exam, as we know in many countries. But the idea of the meaningful learning was that 30% of the grade was different assessments, alternative assessment for students. Students are working independently and in groups, all kinds of idea, but this constructed 30% of the grade. And it's important what I wrote in asterisks down. Beyond the general division between 70 and 30% was nothing, just a broad idea. And people have to think also, very similar to UK and probably to other countries, that in Israel, teachers were used to, this was the paradigm, this was the mental model for top-down reforms. And suddenly they were brought with a very general definition, what is a meaningful learning reforms? And they had to cut the matriculation, the grade, into 70%, the regular external matriculation exam, and 30%, that's up to you. Do whatever you want to. Again, an anecdote. When this started, I talked to the Secretary General of the Ministry of Education. And she is a great person, no doubt. But she said, what's going on? We gave you everything. Everything is open. Why are you not taking it in both hands? What's going on? Why are you so critical about this? Finally, we gave you everything. Do whatever you want. Create 30% in high school. Why you're not taking it in both hands and continue and invent, do whatever you want. And that's the idea of how people constructing meaning from prior experience and the context that they're in. So in terms of the method at that time, and I want to stress, this was the first few months of the reform. Afterwards, I will talk about later, it was changed. They saw that they have to give guidelines, but that was at the really 3, 4, 5, 6 months of initiating these reforms, where teachers were given only broad idea without almost any guidelines, anything, just experience, invent, do whatever you want. So we interviewed 65 participants, and I will not get into details. We did a semi-structured interview with questions such as what characterizes your educational work during the reform, what are your difficulties, and also we worked according to the usual, I would say, qualitative research. We did a member check. I like member check for students. It's like sending the transcript back to the interviewee and asking them, it's a kind of validity, asking them, okay, it's also a part of honoring them, sending the transcript and asking them, can you read it again? Did I miss something? Do you would like to add something more? So it's a kind of validity check for us as researchers in terms of sending the transcript to the interviewees. So when we analyzed the information, the data, we came up with two basic categories, themes, and it's really, when I will give the example, it will be hard to make a division, to divide them, because they are so interrelated. But it's important for me to show you a few quotes from these two categories. The first one was coping with ambiguity, and the ambiguity was so, I would say, hard, so big here in terms of what the hell we should do in terms of these amorphic ideas. And one of them said, I think what is characteristic of this reform is that no one truly understands the messages that are supposed to reach the ground, as they are very confusing. The teacher don't know what to do, and it's one great big chaos. And it was also in the media, I would say, reaching levels that bring me to doubt if all of it worth it. Why do I need to get into this mess if I don't understand how to take the idea into practice? Some of the reform elements are good, and the general idea is positive, but I'm not sure it's worth enduring the current confusion. And I just would like just one thing in terms of change processes. We need to hold this confusion, because confusion is good in terms of doing really, I would say, we call it second order change. But I would argue that this person needs scaffolding, working with, need mentoring, how to hold this confusion in terms of change processes. Another quote was the following: at this point, the school is like a factory that has gotten some new technology that the workers are finding it hard to activate since the instruction sheet is missing. One of the things that I like, Gavin, to do when I'm sending and I'm doing by myself interviews is to ask for a metaphor. And this is all the time. One metaphor that for your role as a principal or middle leader to the situation. And at that time, and you say it's like someone said here, activate since there's no instruction sheet. People told me it's like you're sending us to the army to fight without army weapon. You are sending us to hunt even. I remember the quotes, to hunt without hunting weapons. What's going on? We need to know how we need to work in school according to these ideas. The school has undergone a significant change, and maybe it's even a change for the better, but the instructions are absent. This means that the whole program is incoherent, and students are in situation of uncertainty, as are teachers, the administration, and even the superintendent. It's all the superintendent, administrators, and teacher. All the components that needs to work together were in total confusion. And I would stress again, that was the case in the first 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Also, when you ask the education minister a specific question, like, how do I actually do this? And there were all kinds of conferences at that time asking, ask the minister, I would say. And and his staff find it difficult to answer. This feeling that there are no answer is a big obstacle. The moment this is not clear, it's like a food chain. And this is what I have encountered. This vagueness goes on from level to level, superintendent, principal, coordinator, and teacher. The teacher have justly complained that they don't know what they are supposed to do and have no address to turn to. And for me, the most important, usually I'm bolding some kinds of letters and have no address to turn to. The confusion is okay in terms of change processes. But we already see from the code that they didn't have an address, they didn't have a coach, they didn't have a facilitator to understand, start holding, and I would say holding this confusion and start learning and working on this. So, and the other category, which is again very, very, very similar, was a need for self-reliance. So the first quote is the education ministry waves slogans and it's not always aware of the actual school reality. It offered this meaningful learning reform, and it seems we are on the brink of it. It is no big achievement to blurt out slogan. Teacher must be given tools. I would not continue, but the first one say we need tools, something to rely on. The other one, which is slightly different, says as a subject coordinator under the reform, I felt as though I was thrown into a water or initiated by walking into a fire. And Gavin, that's stressful. That's stressful. If someone is saying it, that's fine. If you're going to a new territory, that's fine. But who is holding the big picture? Who is holding the facilitator, being a mentor to this kind of middle leader? This is all well and good, but there's nobody in the administration or in the superintendent that can guide you optimally. So the first one wanted tools. This one wants someone at the environment, superintendent, administrators, someone to provide mentorship. And the third one, it's a little bit different because this, he or she, I don't remember, the reform required us to reinvent our teaching without any help. But we all have many years of experience behind us. And for me, experience is almost always the best source of knowledge. It is the most effective professional development I have ever undergone. So I'm thinking that this person is saying, which is not similar to the prior one, I would like someone maybe working with me on my prior experiences in order to understand the situation, the new situation. So although the quotes are almost similar, you can see variation within them. So these were the two most, I would say, important categories, and they were overlapping. And especially, and I said at the beginning, that was published in Leadership and Policy in Schools, the discussion was how much scaffolding we need to work with staff members, because we saw that if the resources for sense making, for coming together and understanding the big picture based on experience, knowledge, environment, so if we have enough resources, we are strengthening the ability of people, in our case, teacher, to cope with ambiguity. But by contrast, if the resources for sense making, for understanding together, it's important, it's not an individual process, it's a collective process. If they don't have the time and space for coming together and understand the process, probably, it's not black and white, of course, but probably they will lose sight of what they are trying to do and why. And this is very important for us, very important for superintendent, for the ministry, for principal to understand. And it's not only reform that coming from ministry, it's also change processes within the schools. And this is a continuation, again, going back to the importance of scaffolding. Logically, as the Secretary General, as I told you, Gavin, said, why you're not holding it, taking it in both hands? Logically, that's right. But without scaffolding, without coming together, the senior management, the district, the superintendent, and the ministry, I would argue that there would no ability for sustainability here. So people will go because there's in their mind it's still the pyramid, the top down, and they need to do it. But any change, any ministry change, and here in Israel, probably in other places, every 2 years, 3 years, we have a ministry change. And all the people will go back to zero, I would call it. They go back to the same old habits. So only scaffolding by trying to make sense together the confusion, the ambiguous and uncertain situation. This is, for me, I would argue, the most important thing for sustainability of educational change. So if you ask me, and I'm trying even with my PhD student to be practical, and there are all kinds of things that we can do in order to provide scaffolding. And I would argue, Gavin, that I finished my PhD 23 years ago. And I started all the time to talk about organizational learning. And whatever I use, whether it's reform coming down, whether it's professional learning community, I'm going all the time to the same idea. I cannot fly or go to other, all the time it's bringing me together to the same idea, how we can bring together people specifically in situation of uncertainty. And one thing that we saw, especially, and there are publications about the 2014 UK reform, and also in other places, that principal networks or middle leader networks are very important for people because they are getting the reflection of their ideas and other people in the community. So we see specifically in all kinds of professional learning community that principal networks, and I had a PhD student that did a superintendent network, and I never heard it in the world, but there was at that time superintendent network that worked together to understand the vague ideas. This is very important for me, and I think that helps in order to bring people and make sense of ambiguous educational reform. And another one, and I will just stop for a minute and then continue to the research. This is a picture from my university, and I was in charge at 2012 to construct the first simulation center at the university in Israel. I will come back to the research, but it's important because it's making connections. And we took this idea from hospitals because hospital understood that they can not only instruct future doctors by cognitive aspect, but also the interpersonal aspect, how to work with critical incidents, coming to your physician and trying to work with ill people. So we took the idea to the academia, to schools of education, and this is a picture from my university. I have to tell you that until now, it's like 10 years after, there are 20 centers of simulation in the colleges of education throughout the country. But, and this is a big but, it's nice that people are coming to the academia, to the people who think so much to the academia to do all kinds of simulation. And we are bringing superintendent and principals and beginning teachers. But I would argue that in each school, there should be a simulation center. There should be a field of play, not only for students, but also, and even more important, for teachers coming and playing and making simulation, all kinds of simulation. You don't need all this technology. You can do it without the technology. It doesn't cost much, but you can do it without the technology. And this is also like network, a way to bring people together and make sense of what's going on. And this is hard because you have to create, I would call it again, a field of play within schools. a time and space where teachers are coming, and it doesn't mean that when they're going out, there's no hierarchy. There is a hierarchy, but a time when you're making the hierarchy flat and you can think, and this is also connected to my other area of research, system thinking. Try to understand what's going on in the school. If you're doing something here, what is the implication in another place at the school? So network, principal network, superintendent network, middle manager network, and also simulation, in my opinion, as we see it, is a good way to start this idea of bringing people together and making sense of what happened, and hopefully it will sustain education reform. And the last thing, as we all know in research doesn't end. And of course, we can do it in different social cultural contexts. This is this kind of research. As I mentioned before, sense making or perception or working together, we cannot try to measure it independently, the individual teacher. We are trying to see how a group-based network of sense making. So for us, in this case, we took only, of course, middle managers, grade level coordinators. But if you saw a holistic approach, you need to see how superintendent, how principal, or how other grade level or subject matter coordinators are working together, because it's a holistic approach to change. And of course, the last point is we need the longitudinal research. As I said, the data was gathered in the first 3, 4, 5, and 6 months of the reform. And after 6 months, the ministry understood that something is lacking here and start giving all kinds of guidelines. And on the continuum, they shifted from very open, very, let's go inductive, invent yourself, to the other side of providing guidelines. So as researchers, and I have to admit, we didn't do it, we need to continue gathering data from the different stages of reform implementation. That's it. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. And I know in the Irish context, much of what you speak about can be connected to our own recent curricular reform in secondary or post-primary, and future reforms coming down the track. We've reformed, if you like, the junior part of secondary education, and now moving towards senior cycle. And the question of the generally outlined nature of it is one that certainly teachers and school leaders are just probably wondering about, I think, and is certainly raising some debate, as well as in primary schools where there's been changes in language curriculum and well-being frameworks, school evaluation changes, the list goes on. So huge relevance here for the Irish context. One of the messages I suppose I took from your talk is this question of holding space for confusion and ambiguity, and that actually that can be very helpful when it comes to maybe leadership development, professional development, and second order change. We might be inclined to think that ambiguity and confusion is a bad thing. So maybe if you could just talk about that, it's a message maybe school and system leaders might need to reflect on and think about more.
First, you're absolutely right. The confusion itself is an important part of a change process. Usually we have the term single loop learning, single loop change, and double loop learning, double loop change. When you're making change within the guidelines, people will they will know what to do and go right and left and know what to do. The basic idea is what happened when you're doing a double loop change. And double loop change at the first components of it, the first time, the first period, by nature, it requires confusion. And it depends how principal and the team are trying and can hold it. And this is something that we need to talk more and practice more at the principal preparatory programs. I would argue that a lot in the academia, we are teaching it. Cognitive aspect will not do the message. We need all the time to practice it, because understanding how to deal with confusion, we need to practice it all the time. That's why I gave the idea of interaction, of simulation. It's all the time a matter of practice. I would argue also, as you said, that you have all kinds in the Irish context, you have all kinds of reforms. It would be, it's again, not a black and white, it would be, in my opinion, easier to work this confusion in elementary schools. I'm arguing all the time that as you're going up is not a better or worse, but as you're going up, you are getting a less and less organizational learning. And my joke is that the organization that is the very, very least in terms of learning is the academia universities, because we are all the time that the division of labor. But I would argue that it would be easier to start having the time and place for confusion, for practicing it, for having a field of play, a practicing room, much easier at the elementary level than at the middle and high school level.
Mm-hmm. I suppose COVID probably taught us too, and I'm thinking here about Heifetz's work on technical and adaptive leadership. The change that just automatically kicked in from COVID, it became a policy issue, but in many ways it wasn't very, it just was instantaneous. It was, total, came out of the blue. Mm-hmm. I suppose, the ambiguity, the confusion there, unless you embrace that, you're stuck on a very technical approach to leadership as well, aren't you? Because the emotional aspects that are connected to leadership really here seem to me to feed in and connect to that adaptive drive to arrive at better outcomes and to seize and, I suppose, embrace your professional agency.
So I think I would give two examples. At the research institution that I'm leading, and we did all kinds of important things during the COVID, and everything was changed. But now we are at a stage where did we really made a change, or are we coming back to the same ideas? So it's all the time how you hold the confusion, and how much you let and make changes, and how much you are within the old paradigms. One more thing that I will tell you before I'm answering is the most important thing that happened to a principal at the COVID is that changed their idea. They started managing the school from far away. They told us all the time, we're not going at the corridors. We do not know how to manage school from so far away without the tangible, without seeing the people, without holding, without going into the corridors. And it's a long process that we work with them in order to see that they can handle this. But you said very important thing, that it's not even in the preparatory programs, it's not only the cognitive. There are new issues that getting into developing principles, developing the next generation of principals and middle leaders, which are much more emotional, much more norms, values, etc. I would just give an example. In JA last year, we had a special issue on mindfulness and principles and leaders. I could not imagine this idea of talking about how to embrace principles, how to develop principles from mindfulness perspective 20 years ago. So we understand that because of the uncertainty, we need also in 21st century skills, and we need first of all to develop a more holistic principles, more holistic leadership, because they are the next generation that will work with students who are coming, the new generation of students who are changing profession every 2 years, doing so much things. And we need also principals who are very, very agile, very flexible to see the whole perspective, especially also from the emotional aspect.
It seems to me in some of my reading of the sense-making literature, Ken, that there's, the whole sense-making side of it and also sense-giving. And I was reflecting as you were talking about, for example, the simulation centers. It seems to me like there might be also possibilities for thinking about sense-making and sense-giving as part of core practices that we might expect leaders to employ, like mentoring, giving feedback, coaching, etc. as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because here at the research, we talked about sense making, how something is coming to you from outside and you are making sense according to prior knowledge. But how all kinds of devices like the network, like the simulation, are providing a place to enact meaning, to bring new meaning. So that's why, again, I'm saying all kinds of simulation, of network, of reflection processes, although policy makers see it as very remote from the classroom activities, but we see in our research that there's a connective link between professional learning community ideas working together, coming back in a simulation center where you have an opportunity to enact meaning and their implication to what's going on within the classroom. And it's all the time, I have to say, we haven't changed by large the way the structure of the schools, because we are still relying on schools as they were built 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And the idea is how a good things and teachers are doing wonderful things within classroom, how the wonderful things are going out and how wonderful things are going and penetrating the walls inside. So all kinds of how you try to make or think that schools are not only providing information, but also creating and enacting information. And this is the most important thing for teachers. And I think this is the most priority of principals. The priority of principal, they are in charge of everything. The most priority of principal is not to be in charge of student grades. Their priority is to see how to enact, how to create, how to develop the professional development of their stuff, teaching stuff.
Yeah. My final question, Ken, before we wrap up is, it seems, I think it's clear, sense making is inherently a collective, a group process. You might be inclined to think it's very individual, but actually there's more than that involved. I wonder if then, in terms of we're thinking about policies and leaders at all levels in the school, because it's collective, is there scope, do you think, maybe more for policymakers and the implementers, that's to say the school leaders, to work collectively about making sense of reform and to really think about maybe co-production of policies in newer, more sustainable ways?
We have all kinds of programming in the National Institute that I'm leading it's all the time working in the policy, the practice, and all kinds of philanthropy coming into, bringing money into. And we see that the idea of coherence, how different people are thinking about, for example, what does it mean professional learning community? And the most important thing, and I would argue again and again, if we cannot make a collective effort of sitting together with the ministry, with policymakers, with the Ministry of Education, with the superintendent, and with teachers, we are just all the time perpetuating whatever we did before. So we are just perpetuating the top-down metaphors that we will continue because we need to be. We are a teacher, we are required to be, and people are telling us what to do. But it's not what I call it, it's doubt and doubting. You can bring a beautiful idea. If you not connect the doubting process properly, you will start going, but whenever you go into the implementation and sustainability process stage, you will just go back to the 0 point, and every change that will happen at school, at the content, at the ministry, people will just go and go to the zero ground, whatever they are no according to their mental models.
Mm-hmm. And it's been really interesting to hear about the research you've been conducting, over a sustained period of time. And thanks very much for sharing with us it with us today.
Thank you very much.